into forgetting what I was going to say there. Committee, I've got final action at the end of the meeting, but I'd like to, with your indulgence, go ahead and start working a couple bills because we need to get them out. And so I would like to start with House Bill 2206. Could I get a motion, please? Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that we pass out House Bill 2206 favorably for passage.
Do I have a second from the Vice Chairman? All right, and Mr. Advisor, could you remind everybody what it's about? And go ahead and hand out the balloon while you're doing that.
Campaign finance bill that recodifies the statutes and renames the Governmental Ethics Commission and makes some definitional changes and so on. And I will pass out this. The committee got a copy of these amendments during the hearing, but
Wait, no, this is
2206.
2206. You described it correctly.
Right. Jason has got the amendment.
Okay, committee, so I'm going to do something a little irregular here. I'm going to ask the representative from the Kansas Ethics Commission to come up quickly and talk about some of these amendments that we have in front of you now. Sorry, I sprung that on you. Okay.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to present. So as I presented last time.
Identify yourself for the record, please.
Absolutely. My name is Caitlin Bull-Stewart. I'm the General Counsel of the Kansas Governmental Ethics Commission. I've spoken with Mr. Nye and have looked at some of the balloon amendments that have been presented. As before, the commission is neutral on the policy decision, but I will comment on how some of these suggested amendments will lessen the negative impacts of this bill. So the first that I want to address is the change to the political committee definition based on communications with one another. The amendment changes the determination of the total program spending of a political committee. Instead of just being based on a single year, it's a 5-year look back. That would decrease the risk of some of the gameability that we addressed the first time by having a larger look back. It allows for the commission to look at more data and to allow for more clear compliance while still addressing some of the concerns of ensuring we have a constitutional definition. Additionally, that there are still some risk of gameability and on how the commission investigates, but having that change helps. Additionally, the threshold for the political committee definition in the amendment has been lowered from $5,000 to $3,000, which will decrease the fiscal impact on the agency based on political committee registration fees. As I mentioned, it's based on those different political committee registration thresholds, but lowering it down would decrease the amount of political committees that are no longer filing at all. So it does resolve some of those concerns. And then additionally, there was a change, a line that was deleted, page 14, lines 28 through 30, that had some language about nullifying agreements that made it appear, based on the language, that the commission couldn't use evidence of a pass-through scheme, and the elimination of that sentence, I believe, eliminates some of that ambiguity. I will say again, the commission is not commenting on the policy, but just wanted to give some comments based on these balloon amendments. And I'm open for questions if you have any, but otherwise, I appreciate you consulting us and offering the views on the impacts.
Committee, does anybody have any questions for Ms. Bull-Stewart? Okay, thank you very much for taking the time.
Absolutely, thank you.
Committee, with those comments, I would like to make a motion to amend. Do I have a second? Representative Penn beat you to it there, sorry. All right, is there any discussion on the amendment? Questions, concerns? Okay, seeing none. All those in favor of amending signify by saying aye. All opposed, no. Okay, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. We're back on the bill. Is there any discussion on the bill? Okay. Representative Penn, will you renew your motion as amended?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I move that we pass out favorably House Bill 2206 as amended for passage.
Okay, do you renew your second? The Vice Chairman renews his second. You've heard the motion. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All opposed, no. Okay, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion passes. All right, committee, I'd also like to take a look at House Bill 2106. Mr. Revisor, could you give us a description and pass out the amendments?
This bill, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, deals with promoting or opposing the repeal of provisions of the Kansas Constitution, and provides basically that a foreign national cannot make contributions and so on. There's some amendments that have been passed out, which the committee saw during the hearing, and it adds more substance to the prohibition against foreign contributions.
Okay, are there any questions for the revisor? Okay, I probably should have started with this, but the chair will entertain a motion on this bill. Mr. Vice Chairman.
I would make a motion that we take House Bill 2106 favorably for passage.
Okay, and a second by Representative Penn. Is there any discussion on the bill? Okay. Representative, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the balloon amendment is what I would be referencing.
Okay.
So the question about the not only taking each donor named in such report is not a foreign national and has not knowingly accepted contributions or expenditures either directly or indirectly within the 4-year period immediately preceding. Can you kind of explain just kind of the punch of that?
Yep. So I probably should have started with, I make a motion to amend, and is there a second to amend? That's my fault. Okay, second from the Vice Chairman. Okay, is there any discussion? To answer your question, so these amendments, the proponents for the bill suggested these amendments to basically give teeth to and definition to what the kind of what constitutes contributions, what would kind of be the trigger threshold. Because the challenge is you're probably talking about a 501c3 or C4, and we want to make sure that we're not, you know, making every nonprofit in the state of Kansas throw open their books and, you know, show us all their donors. So we have to basically have evidence of a pretty significant contribution in order to kind of trigger that action. That's kind of the point, I think, of that balloon, or that section. Yes.
If I can ask, each person who submits a report, so this is like the treasurers of the different, you know, campaign committees? Is that who each person is?
I might defer to the revisor, but I would imagine yes. So if you're, go ahead, Mr. Revisor.
Look at first page in section 1, the first sentence, actually, every person who engages in any activity promoting or opposing. So it can be an individual person or it can be an organization.
Okay, is there any more discussion on the amendment? Representative Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think during the discussion around the bill, there was made mention of competing news organizations. And so my question then would be, you know, kind of around that, would this include, so, I mean, we're talking about political ads, maybe conversations being had on different websites or news article, paper publications or maybe like the talking heads on a news channel, you know, we understand that those organizations are funded by many different groups who may have foreign nationals that contribute to them. Would this also include that as part of it?
It would not, Representative. So the discussion in the hearing was about States Newsroom, which funds news organizations around the country, including Kansas Reflector. And I specifically asked the question of the conferees to make it clear this does not in any way impact that. This impacts somebody who does express advocacy for or against a constitutional amendment. And there's like a list of kind of magic words and phrases that constitute, like, you know, vote for, vote against, that constitutes express advocacy. And so, and this would in no way impact those news agencies.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So just to follow up, are those news agencies, let's say a national one like Fox or MSNBC? I'm sorry, it's really hard to see.
I'm sorry.
Are they aware of these provisions within, that would be made with this bill that could possibly affect them in that way? You know, because occasionally I hear someone on one of the networks say, you know, if you vote for this XYZ or vote for this or support this person, and that seems like express advocacy to me, but I wonder if they would necessarily know that and if it really would affect them, because I know locally it may be a little bit different, but at these national levels, I have concerns about that.
Representative, I would contend that a person who says that is not spending money. They're just saying it, and that's a, you know, First Amendment protected right. This is about spending money on express advocacy. So like doing print ads in a newspaper, doing you know, TV advertising, doing mailers. That's what's covered in this. I think we had a bit of a discussion in the hearing. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble seeing you too. We had a bit of discussion in the hearing, and I think it was made pretty clear that those news agencies are not covered under this bill.
Okay, I appreciate you indulging my question.
And I would not even be working the bill if I was concerned about that, because you know, I take free speech very seriously. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Yes, I think it also helps if you look at line 10 and 11. It's not only people who engage in activity opposing or adoption of a repeal, but it's people who accept money or property for the purpose of engaging in such activity shall make an annual report. So there has to be like a contribution angle to it before it would ever come into play.
Is there any other discussion on the bill? Or I'm sorry, on the amendment. We're still on the amendment, so try to restrict it to that. Representative Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Has there been much discussion about how we would address knowingly or unknowingly accepting the contributions? How we would prove that someone did know or did not know? I'm sorry if that's a naive question.
I don't think it's a bad question. I think that, you know, that would be part of, you know, if somebody was suspected of violating this statute, should it become law, there would be discovery, there would be subpoenas, there would be, so they'd have to, you know, they would have to build a case, you know, beyond a reasonable doubt that somebody knew that the person they were getting the money from was a foreign national in order to trigger this. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Just again, looking at the ramifications or the practical outworking of this, I'm assuming that this is like on your, when you file your, you know, your your required reports, your contributions and expenditures reports, that there will, appear a line at the bottom that you have not accepted any money from foreign nationals, or I suppose this wouldn't be for candidates since that's already banned, but this would be for, you know, if you're the committee to, you know, amend the Constitution of Kansas, you know, that there would be a place on the report that they submit, that there would be some sort of affirmation of such. Is that, how do you envision this? Or
Mr. Advisor, you want to take a crack at that?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry.
Okay. Where it says about the person accepting contributions shall require each donor to certify that such donor is not a foreign national. And then it's also, I'm believing, so would there be a form? I guess there's a form. I'm curious about the form to the donors, but is there not a place on the report that they file that they, that none of this money came from foreign nationals, either directly or indirectly?
I'm not sure this addresses the form. I assume that there would be a form provided, so.
I think part of the reason that this legislation's kind of being considered is because these agencies don't report right now because they're engaged in, they're not covered in the Campaign Finance Act right now because they're not a PAC.
I also am going to assume that the Ethics Commission would come up with a form.
Okay, Mr. Ranking Minority Member, and then Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm coming to understand the balloon amendments, and I appreciate the opportunity for the discussion. My concern is in reference to the word indirectly, and I believe that's what my colleague was kind of making reference to. Are we expecting indirectly to be further defined by the Ethics Board or something else? Because it could be inadvertently not my impact, and all of a sudden it's identified that I got indirectly received contributions.
I think that that's the reason for the declaration where the person who's donating has to certify that they did not receive foreign money. And so that's the indirectly piece, I believe. Representative Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question was kind of, you might have answered it by mentioning the Ethics Commission or if the name has changed or on page 2, line 30, it starts a new paragraph that says the commission shall. There's no reference earlier in this bill to what commission. Is that the Ethics Commission we're talking about currently? Okay.
And that's currently in statute. That's not a change. That's currently in the law.
Okay, good. Thank you. I was pulling up the statute, so I was trying to find where it references the commission earlier. So thank you for that clarification.
Are there any other questions on the amendment? Okay. Seeing no more questions or discussion, I close on my amendment. You've heard the motion. All those in favor of amending signify by saying aye. Opposed, no? Okay, the ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. We're back on the bill. Is there any more discussion on the bill? Okay, seeing none. Mr. Vice Chairman, almost there.
Almost got away. The bill now as it stands, it talks about the aggregate exceeding $100,000 within a 4-year period. What is the point of that? I mean, so there is a threshold that they can have foreign national money, or what?
Again, we're kind of trying to tread lightly so that, like I said, we're not throwing open the books of every nonprofit that participates in Kansas politics, and so the proponents suggested this limit so that we're not, so that we're targeting like folks that are taking a large amount of money.
So it's not a blanket ban exactly. It's disclosure, and it sets some limits, the $100,000 limit.
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
All right. Are there any other questions on the bill or discussion on the bill? Okay. If not, Mr. Vice Chairman, will you renew your motion?
Yes, I move that we pass out House Bill 2106 as amended.
Will you renew your second, Representative Penn? Okay. You've heard the motion. All those in favor of passing House Bill 2106 favorably for passage signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion carries. All right, committee, we have one other bill that we heard yesterday, or I'm sorry, Thursday, 2056. Mr. Advisor, could you give us a short synopsis of that bill? I have the wrong number, so we'll just move on. I'm sorry. Yeah, I apologize. That's today's hearing. I apologize. Yeah, bitch, what is the number? I'm sorry. That's the one I'm talking about. 2016. Okay. Thank you, committee, for putting up with my senility. Mr. Advisor, would you please tell us what 2016 says?
The bill basically allows the county election folks to look at obituary notices published online by funeral homes. Right now, they look at obituaries published in newspapers and so on to glean the voter registration rolls of folks that have died.
Okay. The chair will entertain a motion on this bill. Okay, Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that we pass out House Bill 2016 favorably for passage.
Okay, I've got a second from Representative Berquist. Is there any discussion on the bill? Okay. Seeing none, Representative Penn, will you close on your motion?
Mr. Chairman, I close.
All right. Committee, you've heard the motion to pass 2016 favorably for passage. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All opposed, no. Okay, the motion carries. All right, thank you for indulging me and getting that done first. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next order of business, which is a hearing on Senate Bill 4. Mr. Advisor, could you give us a overview of the bill?
Mike Heim with the Revisor of Statutes Office. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, what this bill does is it provides that all advance voting ballots have to be received in the office of the county election officer or the polling place basically by 7 p.m. on election day. So it eliminates the 3-day grace period. It passed the Senate 29-10.
Are there any questions for the revisor? Okay, seeing none. Thank you very much. All right, we'll move on to proponent testimony, and our first proponent is Mr. Jason Sneed on WebEx. Sir, can you hear me?
I can, Chairman Proctor. Thank you for allowing me to join you virtually today.
Thank you, and welcome back to the committee.
It's good to be with you all again. I wish I could be there in person, but nevertheless, it is good to be able to join you in support of Senate Bill 4. Again, my name is Jason Sneed. I'm the Executive Director of Honest Elections Project Action. We are a nonpartisan and nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting election integrity. Put simply, SB 4 is a straightforward and necessary update to Kansas election law that would shift your state away from the current postmark standard for advanced voting ballots to an unambiguous and clear rule that every vote cast in an election must be received by 7 p.m. on election day in order to be counted. Adopting this legislation will promote election integrity and public confidence in our election system. By requiring advanced voting ballots to be received by the close of polls, SB 4 will speed vote tabulation, ensure the delivery of timely and accurate results, and improve public confidence. Shifting to an objective receipt deadline also avoids messy post-election litigation. In states with postmarking standards, these lawsuits often revolve around efforts to count late ballots that arrive either without a postmark or without a legible postmark. And thus, there is no guarantee that those ballots were not fraudulently cast after the election was concluded. Few situations do as much to sap public trust as prolonged vote counting or litigation aimed at affecting election results by counting otherwise illegal votes. This bill's provisions make both situations less likely. Moreover, passing SB 4 would align Kansas with the current national standard, which is in place in a majority of states. In fact, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures, 32 states already require ballots to be received by the close of polls on election day. This includes both blue and red states and all of Kansas's nearby neighbors. Furthermore, polling shows that the public strongly favors these laws. In fact, polling conducted by Honest Elections Project shows that 89% of Americans believe that ballots should be received by election day. It should also be noted that under SB 4, Kansans would still have ample opportunities to cast ballots in an election, whether voting early in person, by mail, or on election day. But clearly defining the deadline for receiving these ballots as the close of polls will actually make it easier for people to anticipate when they need to cast their votes, and therefore would make it both easier to vote and also harder to cheat. Ensuring that a mail ballot is received by election day is a simple requirement, both for voters to meet and to anticipate. And as I mentioned previously, this is a requirement which is overwhelmingly embraced by the voting public. Thank you for considering this testimony, and I am ready to answer questions if there are any.
Committee, are there any questions? Representative Bergkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It hasn't been a secret that the Postal Service has struggled in recent years getting mail delivered promptly. Is there any thought to saying if you mailed it, if you had a postmark like 4 days before the election, even if they received it 2 days after, it still count? Because you know what I mean, like you mailed it a week in advance thinking it's going to get there in time, but it takes 10 days. So is there any thought to that as far as, or any issue with the Postal Service taking longer and longer? And people thinking, well, I mailed it 5 days in advance, but it took 10 days, and now their votes aren't counting. Has there been any of that discussion anywhere?
No, sir, not to my knowledge. It's an interesting idea, but the problem that you always run into with any postmarking standard is that the temptation will be in a recount or post-election litigation context to ask a court to junk the postmark. And whether that is if a ballot comes in 2 days late, but it was postmarked 4 days early, or if it's your existing statute, what that means then is that you wind up with a law that allows ballots to come in after an election is concluded without the corresponding safeguard meant to ensure that the ballot was not put into the stream after the election was concluded. The other piece of this that we need to keep in mind is that by relying on the postmark, you are in essence relying on the post office to postmark every single ballot. And we already know that despite their best efforts, not every ballot is postmarked. And even ballots that are postmarked, that mark is not always legible by the time it is received by an election official. So what you then are doing is saying that that this safeguard, which is designed to prevent fraud, could actually wind up tripping up perfectly lawful ballots, because through no fault of the voter, if the post office screws up the postmark, then their vote might not count. So it's much better to move to the receipt deadline so that voters can anticipate and get their ballots in far enough in advance where there's a reasonable degree of certainty that they'll be received.
Are there any other questions for Mr. Snead? Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Snead, for your testimony here. Just to clarify, Honest Election Projects is nonpartisan, is that correct?
Yes, sir. Both Honest Elections Project and Honest Elections Project Action are both nonpartisan groups, yes.
I appreciate that. And I'm looking up your survey results that you give, like 89%. And I'm just curious, if you don't have it, can we receive the 1,600 randomly identified? Can we receive the information about the makeup and demographics of these individuals? And the reason I ask that is because I'm looking at the report, and the last sentence of the paragraph says, despite inflamed rhetoric from figures such as President Biden, Barack Obama, and Mark Ely, election integrity remains popular. Now, if we're nonpartisan, I'm not sure why we have that descriptive. That is obviously one ideology. So I would like to take a look at that 1,600 members survey, if you're going to use that, please.
Well, we've posted the survey results online. The survey was a nationally representative sample of registered voters. It's designed to give us a very accurate sense of where the public is on a range of election issues. And the survey consistently tells us, and we've done multiple polls, the survey data consistently tells us that the election integrity policies are very popular with the public. In fact, in many cases, they're more popular now than they have ever been. And the popularity has increased over time across a range of these metrics. I think that what you're seeing with an 89% metric here is just that this is a very common sense position, and most Americans expect there to be timely and accurate election results. This fits hand in glove with that sentiment.
And thank you for that explanation here. Just for the record, I am on, I believe, honestelections.org, which is your site, looking at the information here. And if we are providing an academic reference, it should not be bias, and the sentence that is only focused on Democrats is now makes this survey biased. So I appreciate looking the information, and thank you for your comments.
Representative Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. With all due respect to my confrere here, I'm not sure that it's totally fair to call the Honest Elections Project a nonpartisan organization. It has been financed by the Koch brothers and Betsy DeVos, is part of a partisan group on judicial selection. Could you please explain your answer? I mean, calling voter suppression a myth that your organization has repeatedly called Democrats cheaters. Could you please explain your claim that it's nonpartisan?
Well, respectfully, I would push back that I have used terminology along the lines of calling Democrats cheaters. I do want to also clarify that I'm here today in the capacity, in my capacity as the executive director of the C4 HEP Action Non-Honesty Elections Project. Although both groups are nonpartisan and very determinedly so. We very clearly focus on promoting election integrity, and I stand by assertions that we have made along the lines of, voter suppression being a myth and so forth. If you look at the data, not only are these policies extremely popular, they have time and time again been adopted in states like Georgia, like Florida, that have actually seen, for instance, in terms of voter ID laws, voter turnout has gone up after those laws have been implemented. I was in Atlanta in 2022 interviewing voters going in and out of polling places to ask them about their experience under Georgia's so-called voter suppression law. There were no issues. Voters said they enjoyed the law, and there was actually a public survey which was done, I believe, by the University of Georgia. This is not an HEP survey, that said that nobody in Georgia, no respondents thought it was difficult to comply with that law. This gets to the heated rhetoric that one of the other committee members had mentioned, which is very clearly designed to deter states from taking steps to secure their elections, in part, I think, because so many people find this to be very common sense. The issue with taking Kansas election law in the direction that 32 states have already.
If I may, I would like to stick to my questions here. Your organization did call Democrats cheaters in a video published 4 years ago. An advertisement called "Hard to Cheat" is the name of the ad. I also, just for the record, the attorney that represents your organization is also employed by President Trump, which I, again, make it, it's hard for me to understand the nonpartisan pitch, but that's for the record. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sneed, you make a very good comment or interesting comment about states with postmark standards often end up with or have ended up with lawsuits. And kind of my memory, I don't know if it was like Pennsylvania or California, Georgia. Can you elaborate a little bit on how just having systems where you accept ballots after Election Day that you do end up with, are you potentially going to end up with litigation in contested races?
Yes, postmarking standards and post-election receipt deadlines have been the subject of litigation in a number of states. In 2020, with all the litigation surrounding the COVID election, there were a number of courts that purported to change even election day statutes to post-election deadlines, sometimes without corresponding postmarking. This has been the subject of attempts to extend that deadline in Pennsylvania and other states. The temptation in the course of litigation, and this is temptation which I think any election lawyer, whether you're representing a Republican or Democrat, would be subject to, is to argue in a close race that every ballot that you think is going to count for your candidate should be counted. And so the arguments are invariably made that you should, if a ballot is received by an election official, if it's in that official's hands, that it should be counted, regardless of what the state law says about something like a postmarking standard or voter signature or any number of other requirements that you might put into place. The problem with that, of course, is that those are safeguards that are meant to help prevent fraud and to help ensure the legitimacy of the results. And it is very damaging to public confidence in elections when, in the post-election context, litigation is filed to change the rules in ways that change the outcome of elections. So you don't even need to have a fraudulent ballot counted, but the perception alone is damaging to public trust in the elections. It's much better to have a clear deadline, like what you're considering with SB4, to receive these ballots by election day. The other thing I would add here is that in the context of litigation, there was recently an opinion out of the Fifth Circuit in a case in Mississippi involving Mississippi's allowance of ballots after election day. The finding in the court there was that the federal election day statute actually preempts state law allowing ballots to be received after election day. That's still obviously pending litigation. There will undoubtedly be future challenges, but nevertheless, that's an issue which should be considered. And I would argue that it would be better for Kansas and every state to proactively change your laws to comply with that rather than potentially have it foisted on you through future Supreme Court action in the context of that litigation.
All right, are there any other questions for Mr. Snead? Okay, Representative Penn.
Hey, Mr. Snead, it's Penn. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, sir. Thank you.
All right, it's good to see you again. Hey, listen, when we have, you're going to have the fear-mongering and everything coming up saying that this is going to significantly curtail individuals' ability to have the franchise and access to the ballot. Have you seen that in any other states that have actually implemented this piece? Has it materialized? If so, exactly what does that look like across different types of, different types and swaths of the populace? Might it be minorities, disabled, lower socioeconomic? Can you speak to that as well?
Yes, sir. One of the things that we see is that the rhetoric around election integrity laws and policies is usually very divorced from the public sentiment surrounding those policies. Voter identification laws are a perfect example of this. Again, those laws are very often attacked as being targeted voter suppression, and yet they are extraordinarily popular with the public, whether we're talking about along party lines. Republicans and Democrats and independents all overwhelmingly embrace those laws. Minority voters, Hispanic, Black, embrace them sometimes at higher percentages than white voters. So there's really no there's really no data that suggests that the public in any way is fazed by these sorts of laws. You can't get to almost 90% in favor of an election day receipt deadline, for instance, without pulling in a majority of pretty much every socioeconomic and demographic class in society. That, I think, just reflects the fact that there's a consensus amongst the American populace that these are the sorts of laws that we want to see in our election space. Also, if you look at things like turnout data in states that have passed election integrity laws, as I mentioned earlier, it typically goes up after those laws are passed. Surveys conducted of people who voted in elections under those laws show that they are overwhelmingly satisfied with those laws and that those laws reflect their desire for elections that, as we say, make it easy to vote and also hard to cheat. So to your point, sir, we've got a lot of data that shows that election integrity actually promotes participation through greater transparency and greater confidence in the results.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, sir. If I can ask a quick follow-on two-part. Number one, in these states that have actually instituted these types of voter election laws, have you had much pushback from those who are election officials, might it be secretaries of state offices and the like, county election officials? And then number two, some of the things that you just brought up, what have been some of the remedies that you've seen to alleviate any misgivings or anything that people might say disenfranchises voters or anything like that? Are there practical steps that you've seen taken to alleviate those pressures?
Well, to take the questions in order, to the first point, quite often what you hear is that elections officials favor these sorts of policies, and certainly in the context of a ballot receipt deadline, I have heard election officials say that this would improve their jobs, make it easier for them to conduct elections and so forth. They can focus on counting votes rather than allowing votes to come in. And also, I think that we have to remember all of the skepticism which we have seen over the last 8 years or so surrounding elections. And it's important to note that skepticism surrounding elections is as easily present on the left as it is on the right. In fact, there was one recent poll, I regret I can't remember exactly what the poll was, that basically said that only 1 in 4 Americans felt that both 2016 and 2020's presidential elections were properly decided. With all of the skepticism surrounding elections, most elections officials are very concerned about doing everything possible to promote confidence in the results. So this is a confidence boosting and results affirming change to election law. That's something I think that should be noted. To your second point about remedies and so forth, if there are concerns surrounding the way the public may react to this sort of a change, I would encourage you and your Secretary of State to engage in a public education campaign to make sure that the public is aware of this change and the ways that it might affect their voting. I do think that it's always better to ensure when you're communicating to the public, for instance, if you're going to vote by mail, that you need to allow enough time for your ballot to be received and so forth. It's just a lot better from the individual voter's perspective to be able to anticipate. I have to make sure this is in by election day. The thing I always worry about is that however well-intentioned a post-election grace period may be, it actually could wind up encouraging voters to cast their ballots later than they should. And then even with the postmarking and 3-day grace period, it still may get there late. It may not count. So it almost encourages a false sense of security. And it's a lot better to educate voters ahead of time and make sure that they get their ballots in the mail early enough to be counted and received by election day.
All right, Representative Simmons for the second time, and I'm going to have this be the last question because we got a bunch of other conferees. So go ahead, Representative Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To our conferee, do you think that the hundreds of thousands of dollars in advertisements that your organization has published saying that we cannot trust our system perhaps contributes to the statistic you cite that 1 in 4 don't believe the results?
With respect, I'm not sure what you're talking about there. We, as an organization, are very committed to promoting public confidence and trust in the elections. That's why we do the work that we do. I believe that the best way to do that is through election integrity measures like what you are seeing here before you. This is the sort of thing that the public wants. It leads to faster results, helps to build trust and confidence in the elections, and it is extremely popular. In fact, overwhelmingly popular with everyday Americans, no matter what their political persuasion.
Well, I will say my question is rooted again in the ad that I cited earlier called Hard to Cheat. Thank you.
All right, Mr. Snead, thank you very much for your testimony and standing in front of the firing squad there. Appreciate it. And committee, I will direct your attention to the written only testimony from proponents, and I'll ask before we move on, is there anybody else wishing to speak as a proponent on this bill? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to neutral testimony, and the only conferee I have listed is Mr. Clay Barker from the Secretary of State's office. Welcome back to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker, General Counsel of the Kansas Secretary of State. The Secretary is neutral on this bill. He believes it's the legislative prerogative to set policy, and there's nothing technically complicated about this one way or the other. I've laid out in my testimonies the background of how we got the 3-day grace period. At the same time, the bill moved earlier in the process, the time when voters could request, or the cutoff when voters could request mail ballots. I've given you some statistics on how much, when the mail ballots arrive in the testimony. And also that, just to keep in mind, on election night, about 97% of all votes are counted on election night, those unofficial results, and we don't get the full count until the county canvass. What the Secretary asked me to do was just to lay out for you arguments that we find plausible, that means we're not for or against them, for eliminating the 3-day period, for keeping it, and some arguments that don't exactly hold water when you analyze them. So briefly, arguments for eliminating the 3-day period. One is it's the public confidence issue that election night is over, the polls are closed, but there's still ballots in transmission. They haven't gotten to the election officer's hands yet. And that even public that trust the election system sometimes have concerns with that. People that rely on the 3-day grace period, that their ballots will come in maybe unhappy because it either lacks a postmark or it takes too long to get in. There's not a hard deadline. Third, that there are plenty of options for people to get their ballot in on election night. There's drop boxes. You can take it to any polling place or to the election office and drop it off. And if you go to a polling place, you can cut to the front of the line, put it in a bag. And fourth, it does reduce some administrative burden on election officials that they're not taking ballots on Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, checking postmarks and adding them into the count. Arguments to keep it. Since 2017, the Postal Service has only gotten slower, as Secretary Schwab keeps hammering on. Kansas, it has a 3-day grace period. It's one of the shortest grace periods, but at the other end of the period, we mail our ballots out 20 days before the election. Most states do it earlier in the process, 30 days, sometimes even 45. So we have probably one of the shorter periods of mail ballots being mailed out and returned, and that's because Kansas hooks the closing of our voter registration books on the 21st day before the election to the mailing out on the 20th day. And there have been proposals over time to allow same-day registration, which would decouple from that, or mailing the ballots out earlier, which would decouple from that. And I suggest to the committee, if we wanted to explore either of those, that we give plenty of thought to changing the entire infrastructure and calendar of our elections and not try to do that on the fly. It could have unintentional disruption effects. And last, voters living out of state who are not military, like college students, may have a hard time getting their ballot because it has to go so far and then getting it back in time. And some of those rely on FedEx or UPS, which is a perfectly valid way of getting a ballot back. The two arguments we found that are not that plausible. First is that the late arriving ballots flip the result from election night. You just have to remember, election night is only unofficial. I realize candidates in very close races that are ahead on election night and then suddenly are behind on Wednesday, then ahead on Thursday, feel like the rug's being pulled out from under their feet. We post those results because we believe in transparency. The other option would be just simply not to report results until the canvass. So you're ahead on election night, then you get your final result. But we plan to continue reporting those unless a 3-day grace period is pulled. And last, there seems to always be brought up the military ballots or overseas ballots. Those ballots are different. They are mailed out 45 days before the election. And when the legislature added the 3-day grace period, they did not change the military ballots. In Kansas, those are called absentee ballots. It's a separate statute. The 3-day period was not added to that, and it was not added to the all-mail ballot election, the special election for bond issues. And we believe that if the legislature added it to one type of election and didn't add it to the other two, it did not intend to give it. So you're not helping the military by keeping the 3-day grace period. They, again, different process. And they have some expedited ways of getting ballots back if they have to. And the one request we had, Mr. Chair, was that if SB 4 becomes law and the 3-day grace period is eliminated, that we need those remote ballot drop boxes available to people who suddenly find themselves unable to get to a polling place but still have a mail ballot in hand and need to drop it off. And with that, I'll stand for any questions at the appropriate time.
Anybody have any questions for Mr. Barker before I start badgering the witness? What's your favorite color? Yeah. Okay. So do you know how many ballots showed up during the 3-day grace period in the last election?
Mr. Chair, I know that 2,100 showed up after Election Day and were counted, which would be the ones that had postmarks. And 104 arrived after Election Day without a postmark. I can't tell you if they were within the 3-day or ended up on Saturday or Sunday.
Okay. So in the primary, after the primary, Secretary of State Schwab kind of raised the alarm. And in the press, it said that he said as many as 1,000 ballots were not counted because they weren't postmarked and arrived during that 3-day grace period. Is that the number for that election, or?
Yes, that's correct, Mr. Chair. And may I?
Yeah, please.
I think the difference was that Secretary Schwab had a one-on-one conversation with the Postmaster General, and we were all in the room with them. And the postmaster said for primary elections, because every state does it on its own schedule, there isn't a fixation of the Postal Service on ballot envelopes. But for the general election, because every state does it on the same day, that becomes their priority, which is why there's more of a focus on postmarks and getting the ballots in. And he said that the postmark is really there just to show, to cancel the stamp. so it can't be reused, which sometimes the post office doesn't postmark everything that doesn't need a stamp, but for the general election, they're much more focused on it, which is probably why the numbers dropped.
But in the primary, do you know what percentage of the mail-in ballots that 1,000 represents?
Not offhand, Mr. Chair, but
I do, it's 2%. So 2% of the people who voted by mail in the primary did everything right, and the election office did everything right, but because their ballot wasn't postmarked, their vote didn't get counted, which is half of what got counted in the general election. I mean, that's just crazy to me. Before we had the 3-day grace period, how many ballots would generally show up after Election Day?
I don't have that number for you, Mr. Chair. I could ask Mr. Caskey.
Okay, because the last time we heard this bill that you guys had the numbers, so I'd appreciate if you could send us numbers. But if I remember correctly, it was about 2,000 ballots that would show up after the election. And now that we have the 3-day grace period, about 2,000 ballots show up after the 3-day grace period.
Yes, Mr. Chair, I think the Postal Service is slowing down, so you need the numbers from 2016 and earlier.
Yeah, I guess what I would say is the people adjust their behavior to what the rules are. And if you tell them there's no 3-day grace period, they'll probably just turn it in earlier.
And we'd agree with that, Mr. Chair. That's why we need to keep the options open of drop it off at the polling place
Okay.
or box.
All right. Are there any other questions for Mr. Ranking Minority Member?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your testimony, Mr. Barker. Just curious, what is the typical timeline for the close of elections in which they're official? Like, how long is that? 3 weeks, 21 days, a week? What is that? When you finalize the election result for canvassing?
So, Representative, the county canvass is up to 13 days after the election. And so for county positions, that is the final count. For any of you or state election officials or federal, it's the state canvass, which would happen at either the September 1 or I believe December 1 is the cutoff for the state canvass. That's when it becomes final, and we'd issue certificates of nomination or election depending on primary or general.
Thank you. And if, does the 3-day the 3-day grace period, does that impact finalizing the canvassing results?
It has no effect on the timing of the canvass. It just may add in more votes after Tuesday night. But again, there'll be mail ballots that arrive on Monday or Election Day Tuesday that just because of the press of business aren't processed and validated and counted until perhaps Wednesday or Thursday. That happens also. And there's write-in votes, spoiled ballots. Those all have to be.
And so that's why we have that final grace period.
And then the biggest one is the provisional ballots chasing down name changes and things like that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Barker? So I got one more. So I'm putting you on the spot. Rick Pifo, the Kansas County Clerks and Elections Official Association Chair, has submitted opponent testimony. Do all clerks like the 3-day grace period and want to keep it?
Mr. Chair, from our understanding, and especially Mr. Caskey talking and Secretary Schwab talking to county election officials, some want to keep the 3-day grace period because they believe it captures more votes and that's what their role is, and others are against it. They want to get rid of it to simplify their job. So I can't tell you what the split is, but there's county election officers on both sides of the issue.
I was out to see Tatum Stafford at Butler County, the Butler County clerk, on Friday, and the first thing she said to me when I walked in the door is get rid of the 3-day grace period. And it wasn't because it makes her job harder, it's because she's having to throw away ballots, that she can't count ballots because they're not getting postmarked, and she doesn't like that, and I mean, I understand why. That was after she said hello. Okay. All right, thank you, thank you very much, Mr. Barker. Appreciate your testimony. Is there anybody else wishing to speak as neutral on this bill? All right, seeing none, we'll move to opponent testimony, and our first conferee is Mr. Hammett. And I'll ask the opponents, we've got about a half hour left in the committee hearing, so please leave plenty of time for questions. We've got, I think, 4 opponents, so try to keep it to like 4 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. There's a lot to go over here, and I know for some of y'all have been around for a while. We've gone over this year after year, but for some background, this law that creates a 3-day period that's called a grace period, ballot transmission period, whatever you want to call it, it came about because of a specific issue that was brought to the United States Postal Service had brought up to the legislature. And at the time, even then, Secretary of State ks.gov advocated for this 3-day period to be created because mail was slowing in Kansas, processing facilities were closing in Kansas. Now, virtually all mail has to go out of state at some point to even if it's mailed down the street in Kansas. And so it was taking longer for mail to get delivered. They had an interim committee. They had ultimately, it was a bipartisan bicameral bill that was unanimously supported by every single legislator in this body except for Carmichael, Representative Carmichael. So everyone supported this, and it really wasn't an issue, and it wasn't really big news or anything. This was a logistical fix because of government shortcomings. To be clear, people have to turn in their ballot by Election Day. This is not a question of if a voter got their ballot in by Election Day. They have turned it into the federal government, and there's a transmission period where the voter has absolutely no control. Can any of you tell me exactly how many days it will take for you to mail something to your county election office? It might vary depending on the circumstance. You might have a weather event. We don't know that. You can't answer that question. I can't answer that question, which is part of the issue of claiming that voters will simply change their behavior because you take away these 3 days. Another thing to consider is that Kansas has the shortest amount of time between when the clerk is allowed to send the ballot and when the ballot has to be returned in the country. Yes, you'll hear about some states don't have grace periods at all. They also might mail the ballots out 45 days before the election instead of 20 days before the election. When we talk about postmarks, I would actually disagree with that characterization of postmarks in the August primary. I need to pull that data, but I believe it was closer to 100 that was convoluting later arriving ballots and postmarks. But you know, in the general election, we had only 104 that showed up without postmarks. But the only counties that had more than 5 ballots without postmarks were Johnson County, Wyandotte, and Douglas, which correlates to a Postmaster General audit that came out just last year showing that the Kansas City, Missouri processing facilities has staffing issues that's causing delays and other errors in mail. We can specifically see, we know the problem exists and where it's coming from. This is not a problem that's more applicably to the state. It's a specific processing facility that Secretary Schwab has been talking to DeJoy, the Postmaster General, about fixing. The other thing is whenever we heard about the lawsuits that have happened in other states, those states are not Kansas. We have additional laws that make it crimes, which is already in a federal crime, but it's a crime to alter a postmark here. We require you to have a postmark. Some states that's not clearly defined, the grace period and other things. We don't have those issues here. Convincing Pennsylvania law and Kansas law is simply, they are different laws. So that, you know, when national groups make these broad claims about things that really don't apply to how the legal structure works in Kansas, it shouldn't be a basis for passing these bills. One other thing I just wanted to mention is that drop boxes are excellent and a great option if you are in Kansas and you can return your ballot. The first reason that absentee ballots exist is for voters that cannot get there. You have disabled voters, you have college students out of state, and I can tell you that a few years ago, I had to vote by mail from Florida because I was in Florida taking care of my mom as she died from cancer. I didn't have the option to just drive down the street to a drop box. I couldn't leave my mother's side for months, and so I had to vote from out of state. There's only a 20-day window right now, and this simply adds 3 days where voters who did everything right, if their ballot comes in, it was postmarked, it will be counted. Voting for this bill simply is saying that you are going to throw out thousands of ballots. And really quickly, I want to mention that in that new data that the Secretary of State released, or it has been compiling about the general election, if you look at what counties actually benefited from the grace period, the counties that benefited the most are the rural counties of the state. 12% of mail ballots that were counted in Montgomery County were only counted because of this 3-day grace period. The other large ones are Nemaha, which had, 10%, and Seward County, 10% of their mail ballots. These things disproportionately impact, and this 3-day grace period disproportionately benefits counties that are farther away from any mail processing facility, so it takes longer for the ballot to get there. So with that, I'm happy to stand for questions when appropriate, but quite simply, I have never seen any justification to get rid of this 3-day period that cannot be debunked whenever you dig into the research. Thank you so much for your time.
Committee, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and have all the opponents testify, and then we'll open it up for questions. Our next conferee is Roshanae Hamby. Welcome back to the committee. It's been a while.
And I can assure you all, I am not here to fearmonger today. So, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Chairman Proctor and members of the committee, for allowing me to testify today. My name is Roshanae Hamby, and I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the American Civil Liberties Union of Kansas. The ACLU of Kansas is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization with more than 35,000 supporters across the state, working to preserve and strengthen the civil rights and civil liberties of every person in Kansas. With that, I am here to express my strong opposition to SB 4, proposing to eliminate or curtail the existing 3-day mail processing window, because it risks to undermine a well-functioning system that is both accessible, secure, and particularly for voters who depend on mail-in ballots. For many years, every registered voter in Kansas has had the option to vote by mail, making advance voting a trusted pillar of our electoral process. In the most recent election, thousands of Kansans cast their ballot by mail, a clear demonstration of both confidence in the system and in the confidence that it offers. During this time, it was safe and secure because measures like signature verification and a robust tracking system has helped to ensure that mail ballots have been protected from fraud. This system is efficient. Voters, including those in rural areas, benefit from the convenience of voting by mail, and the location offices can effectively process mail ballots even during high turnout elections. It is precisely this reason because mail-in voting works so that local election officials have so much so that local election officials have opposed efforts to repeal and reduce the mail processing window. Restricting this widely used method would only undermine the confidence and the careful and accurate work of our local election officials. Removing or replacing the 3-day voting window would penalize mail-in voters because it will put something that is entirely out of their control on them. The election administration and mail service, especially in rural and western Kansas, simply take time. Especially for SB 4, this imposes a standard of immediacy on voters and postal workers that is unreasonable. This move is out of touch with how physical mail travels, how Kansans live, and how our democracy functions. Ultimately, it would silence Kansas voters, particularly rural voters, by letting fewer of their votes be counted. Furthermore, there is strong bipartisan support for maintaining the mail processing window. Attempts to end this have failed repeatedly in the past, as I'm sure you all are aware. The only impact of repealing this protection would be to count fewer Kansas voters, particularly in rural areas. If Kansas eliminates the 3-day grace period or processing window, it will undermine voter confidence by penalizing those who follow the rules but are failed by government inefficiencies. Voters who request, complete, and mail their ballots on time, doing so correctly, could see their votes discarded because of postal delays. This would disproportionately harm rural voters who often rely on mail-in ballots due to geography or temporary residence. Thank you. And with that, I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much. Our next conferee is Mr. Mike Burgess. Welcome back to the committee, sir. Been a while since I've seen you, too.
Yes, and so I will apologize in advance for those of you that have heard this same testimony in previous years, but there are a number of new folks who have not. So and just for the record, I'm Mike Burgess with the Disability Rights Center of Kansas. So one of the things that I want you to do today is, while all of us think about our experience with voting by mail, I just wanted to share that for people with disabilities, their experience may look very different than yours. And so as you're making this policy, you need to make sure that any changes also are going to work for them, especially ones that are going to disproportionately impact people with disabilities. And so we talked about human behavior and the need to plan. If you talk about people who know how to plan, it's people with disabilities, because they have to make their whole life, whether it's transportation, where they get their food and groceries, get to appointments. For most of the disability transit services, it's kind of like the cable company. You set up a ride and they give you a 4-hour window or 2-hour window, and you hopefully make it on time. Sometimes they don't make it. Sometimes they leave without you. This is just an everyday fact of life for many people with disabilities. So just keep that in mind too as you're doing this. For people with dexterity challenges, just the act of voting. You take a blind voter, for instance. They are unable to vote advance by mail without assistance. And so they're reliant upon, there's other folks with dexterity challenges as well. They have to have somebody in to help them. And that may be certain days of the week. There's a lot of other circumstances. And so all of this calculus is going on as they're walking through this 20-day window to try and get their ballot completed and return back to the election office. So again, we know a lot of people vote by mail and are on the permanent advance list. That is a great service for individuals with disabilities to be able to on that and know they're going to get their ballot by mail. But there are also a lot of people with disabilities who like to vote election day. And unfortunately, in some cases, plans change and not by the persons. It may be the person that's planning to transport them on election day. Their neighbor could be sick or have to go out of town for some reason. And suddenly their plan changed, not at their request. And so any changes like this are going to impact those people the most. And so with that, Mr. Chair, I'd be happy to try and, in the interest of time, I would be happy to yield back any remaining time and answer questions at the appropriate time.
All right, our last opponent that I have listed to speak on the bill is Ms. Seal King on WebEx. Ma'am, are you there?
I am here.
Okay, well, welcome back to the committee, and thank you for testifying. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Seal King. I'm with the League of Women Voters of Kansas. And you've probably heard a lot of our testimony too. This bill came about in 2017 because simply of the delay in postal services. There was no mention of any other reason from all the proponents who were supporting this bill. And that included the Secretary of State's office and the county clerks and various other leaders of different organizations. It was simply because the mail was delayed. The U.S. Post Office had notified them that the mail was going to be delayed and suggest they take appropriate actions. So when they were, on the Senate floor, when this was being discussed, and the idea was brought up of it was caused because of the concern for military ballots. That is not true. Military ballots were corrected by the MOVE Act several years before this was enacted, and it took care of allowing military and overseas voters to vote by email or fax, and eliminated the problem. One of the other statements from the floor when they were discussing Senate Bill 4 was that the Fifth Circuit Court had found that a similar law in Mississippi was unconstitutional. That panel found that all the ballots had to be returned by the close of the election. What wasn't mentioned was that there have been 3 other cases in the last year and a half that have been found in the opposite direction. Cases in Illinois, Nevada, and North Dakota all found that allowing ballots to arrive days after the election, as long as they were postmarked before the end of the election, were acceptable practice. So this lawsuit has a ways to go, and so far, current practice, as in Kansas, is leading 3-1. And that kind of summarizes my testimony. I don't want to go over too much of what other people have already covered, so I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your testimony. This is the last opponent that I have listed to testify orally. Is there anybody else wishing to speak as an opponent on the bill? Okay, seeing none, committee, any questions for any of the opponents? Mr. Ranking Minority Member.
Thank you. Mr. Hammett, is he still here? Yeah, thank you for your testimony. First, sorry about your loss of your mom. With that, though, and just so I show fairness, I'm reading your testimony, and you quote percentages from the Shawnee County, or from the Secretary of State surveying election county clerks. I'm having difficulties finding that source. If you could send it to the committee or send it directly to me, I would appreciate just reviewing that. So
I would be happy to. I just got the data a few days ago myself through an open records request. I believe they're still finishing compiling it for the federal EAC report, but I would be happy to share that, or the Secretary of State's office might have a more updated version even now.
that would be great. Thank you.
Since you're up there, you said that we have a shorter window, I don't remember exactly how you said it, but that we mail out our ballots later than any other state in the country. What's your source for that?
So for the entire window from when county clerks are allowed to begin sending them out to when they have to be returned in the county elections office, I need to I believe it was, sorry, I have like notes on this. I can find that out for sure for you. I also believe the Secretary of State's office has mentioned this before in the Senate when we heard this a few weeks ago, but I'd be happy to pull that. I'm forgetting the name of the statewide comparison group.
So I will give a link to the committee assistant to send out to all of the members of the committee, but that's not accurate. There are a bunch of states that have the same window or shorter windows according to NCSL. But the reason I bring it up, we had a bill last year that would have moved the whole window to the left and not sacrifice any days, and you opposed that one too. So I don't understand why you're even making this argument if, even if we moved the window, you still oppose this concept as a bill.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember the exact logistics of that. I think it was just the equal amount of days on the front end. And I would say that those are not exactly equal things again, like a lot of this is when you get into the weeds of every ballot that's requested by 21 days does not go out on the 20th day. Sometimes it takes counties a few days to get all these ballots out. And on the other end, when people are people, right? Most people are not political government junkies like everyone in this room, right? Most people, they kind of maybe get it and they go, oh my gosh, like the election's, in 2 days or whatever, I need to get this mail ballot filled out and turned back in. So there is a more likelihood of those grace period days being helpful. And then the other thing I'll mention is there are other things like emergency absentee ballots. For example, say you were hospitalized. So it's the day before the election, you're hospitalized, unable to leave the emergency room. Someone could go get the ballot for you as like an emergency request, like your spouse or something, bring it to you, and then maybe they are unable to return it, and so they put it in the mail. There's, that person in that situation would benefit from the 3-day grace period, whereas an earlier mail-out period would not be able to cover that. Like there's just a lot of different situations that fall into absentee ballots and why people would request them that lend themselves to being more likely to be counted because of the 3-day grace period after it than just a couple days before. But of course, absolutely, we support adding more days on the front end.
Okay. And you said during your testimony that you dispute the claim made by the Secretary of State in the Capital Journal, the Kansas City Star, and numerous other newspapers that 1,000 ballots showed up in the 3-day grace period of the primary without a postmark, and something like 600 showed up after the 3 days. What is your justification for disputing the senior election officer in the state of Kansas?
My justification is documents that I did open record request from on their office, and it's a little vague because what they're really saying is they were saying a total number of 2 different issues, and so they were saying, you know, I think it was lack of postmark and received after the 3-day grace period and 1,000 ballots. But I think it was something like in their report, only 90 of those were no postmark. But in the media, it sort of got conflated and lots of narratives got out of that. And it took us several months to get the data. But the 1,000 number is really 2 numbers, and the postmark is the smaller part of that number. But I would be happy to refer that over, or if they want to send the data, I got it from them.
In the interest of things, you know, challenging things that are said in this committee, which I think are untrue, what he said was 1,000 ballots were not postmarked and thus not counted, and 600 other ballots showed up after the 3-day grace period. That's a statement he made. So I just wanted to correct that because it's going out to planet Earth here on YouTube. So are there any other questions for the opponents? Yes. Representative James.
This is for the representative for ACLU, is that right?
Amby.
And that's the only reason is because I couldn't pronounce your first name, and I'd feel very embarrassed about it. So you made the statement, and I'm from really rural counties, 2 of them, and you said that the rural counties wouldn't have a chance to vote, or would have a lot more difficulty in voting. Why did you say that?
Well, I said that because in the state of Kansas, our process is coupled with voter registration. So as soon as voter registration ends, that's when we open up the window for folk to go and vote early. That's a short window. So even if people were to say, let's vote 10 days or 11 days ahead of time, we're not exactly sure that that vote will be counted. So by removing this process, we do away with the ability to ensure, at least at some level, we count votes that trickle in a little late.
And I would say that from rural voting right now, it's kind of switched in the last few years with early voting. There's so many different organizations, area on aging, different organizations that bring them in to vote if they choose to, because that period is extended. But I would disagree with you on getting the word mail-in ballots don't come in on time, because I think they do. It's just a matter of when they mail them. If they get them right away and mail them and not be procrastinating, I just don't see what you see on that. But
I can answer that, Representative. So in this bill, there's not an allocation for voter education, and so I didn't want to make the illogical jump that suddenly, as soon as we ended this process, that people would understand that things had changed.
Okay. And then I would say one thing on the military spending so long during the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, that early on voting may have been difficult for the military getting the ballots back, but I would say that my last 10 years in, from 2001 to 2011, that there was never a challenge. They, from wherever I was, overseas on a ship, they got in on time. So I really appreciate the efforts they made for that. And thank you.
And for the committee, because I know we got a lot of new members that have not been on the elections committee before, UACAVA, which is the law that governs military voting, those ballots have to go out 45 days before the election. The service member can email, can fax, can do all kinds of things in order to get that ballot back. And the deadline in the state of Kansas is still election night, so this law doesn't apply to them. I actually had a follow-up question. So you said voter education is not allocated in this bill. So if we added voter education to money for voter education to this bill and moved it to implement in 2026, so that voters had over a year to be educated on the new timeline, would the ACLU then support this bill?
I think we spoke about this last year, and that's one element in which we could support, but I think I also mentioned that a really great support with this bill would be to allow automatic voter registration so that we can decouple the time between registration and early voting and allow more voters to have time to get to the ballots earlier. So right now, as you know, the 20-day window, I don't think it's because of any nefarious activity. It's just that it's coupled alongside a voter registration. So if we allowed automatic voter registration, we could allow longer days ahead of time for voters to vote.
What does that mean, automatic voter registration?
So right now, as part of the Secretary of State, when this bill has been introduced year after year, is that voter registration is the reason why we have that 20-day window, because we didn't want to confuse folk from people registering to vote in the middle or during the election. So if people were automatically registered to vote with the appropriate channels, of course, I'll leave that to your all's body, then we could do away with that timeline so that we can have that 45 days or longer for folk to come out and to come out and early vote.
Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ms. Rashanae Hamby, thank you for coming today and presenting your testimony. Prior to any of the laws changing, 45 days, 25 days, UCAVA, 3-day grace period, anything like that, what was the standard in Kansas from the ACLU's perspective?
Are you looking at prior to 2016?
Check. For voting.
The standard has changed, but there's always been a early voting period. The reason why this was implemented is so that we can capture votes on the back end because of the processing system from the post office. So when this change happened, that we supported the bill.
Okay, and Mr. Chairman, that's one of the things she just brought up. I've heard conflicting testimony between her and the gentleman from Loud Light, is that on the one hand, that the post office system has no issues, right? And then on the other hand, over in Missouri, the one location does have issues. So I'm kind of confused about the opponents having conflicting testimony here today. Looking at it from the IT perspective, I would say that the further that you get away from voting on election day at the election site, you actually introduce the opportunity for, your words, something nefarious to happen. If we're talking about to have automatic registration, there's no way for us to actually verify and validate that in accordance with the law the way that we're supposed to. So I would be opposed to that as well. I have another question for the Secretary of State's office, if that's all right, Mr. Chairman.
Was there a question for me?
No.
Okay.
Let's let Representative Bergkamp. Did you have a question?
Well,
let's let him ask his question, and then if
Sounds
Mr.
good.
Barker is willing to come back up, I'll.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So we have a lot of historical data, and we talk about suppression a lot. And Kansas obviously has changed our rules on mail-in ballots. Is there any statistical analysis saying that grace period or not increases or decreases voter turnout, or is it basis other factors?
Sure, it's not anything I can speak to specifically right now about voter turnout, but what I will say is that there has been a minimum rejection rate on average of 1.1 of return ballots because they're rejected, a 1.1%. So the likelihood of a ballot being thrown out because of a postage or a signature is very low.
Okay, that's good for now. Thank you.
So to follow up on that, in the primary last year, we were told by Secretary of State's office that 2% of the ballots were rejected because they didn't have a postmark. Was that an outlier?
So I was speaking specifically to thrown out because of signature variation or damage to the mail.
Okay, I thought you said postmark, I thought. Okay, all right. Are there any, so Representative Simmons.
Thank you. I just want to flag for the committee, it was said in proponent testimony that county clerks and election officials were in favor of taking away the 3-day grace period, and I just want everyone to note Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association did in fact submit opposition testimony, written only.
Is there a question? Okay, yeah, and I don't know if you were in the room when I asked, but I talked to Mr. Barker, and that's not a universal opinion. And I just talked to the Butler County Clerk on Friday, and the first thing she told me is get rid of the grace period. So it's not every clerk. She did say hello first. I apologize. We need to challenge anything untrue said in this committee, so I appreciate you. Pointing that out. Yeah, there you go. All right, Mr. Vice Chairman, get this thing back on track. Ask a question.
Mr. Hammett, could he come forward? Davis Hammett, he's back there somewhere still, right? No, again, thank you very much for coming to committee and for testifying. I have a question to just, your conclusion is SB4 is a solution in search of a problem, voter suppression in search of justification. But then earlier in your testimony, you talk about the voters that would be hurt most by SB4 are rural voters like Montgomery County, Nemaha, and such. I mean, so you're trying to tell me this is potentially a voter suppression method, but the Republican legislature is suppressing the vote in Republican-leaning counties the most. I mean, that seems like bizarrely, improbable.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question, because this is something that has kind of blown my mind for the last half decade working on this issue. So any voting method is not inherently partisan either way. Several of the current U.S. Supreme Court justices appointed by Donald Trump actually worked to cure mail ballots in Florida in 2000, right? This historically was considered a very pro-Republican thing, mail voting of older voters using it. And no one really thought much of it. It's a voting method. People vote how it makes sense for them. And then it was during the pandemic that everything sort of became weirdly politicized around voting methods. And that happened in 2020, lots of interest in sort of every direction. And then now, though, as we've gotten farther and farther away from 2020, there was a point where it was, sort of larger amounts of Democrats were voting for it. And that's where we started to see, it was really following that we all of a sudden had bills trying to take away the 3-day grace period that all Republicans had voted for just a couple years earlier. But that sort of partisan advantage of a voting method is, you can maybe in one election see that, but things immediately fade out, right? You see things change. People's voting behaviors change. We saw, look at how many more people voted by mail, I think in 2020 than last election, right? So that's what I think that there is a sort of ideological, although I would argue misled and sort of built on one moment, analyzing one moment of the 2020 election. But this data, even seeing that the postmark issue and the counting of ballots in the 3 grace period of rule, this was like the first time that we saw that data, because right now is the first year we've ever gotten data about what ballots are really being counted in the 3-day grace period, because earlier years, ballots that were actually received before might show up. And, when we talked about that 30,000 number a couple years ago, it was because ballots that had shown up and were in the office, they were being counted maybe, a day after the election. And so we all assumed that meant they came in the grace period. But in reality, they'd actually came in earlier. The county just hadn't processed them yet. And so we are just now getting more accurate data on what ballots really are impacted by the 3-day grace period, and we didn't have that before, which is why I included that here and haven't had that in previous years.
Okay. Let the record stand. It's over like 32 states that have, both, Republican and Democrat leaning states that have ballots are counted on election day, or they have to be received by election day. But my question to you then would also be, in the information that the Attorney General, Secretary of State's office submitted, as far as that, 163,000 plus mail-in ballots came, and there were only, 2,000 plus that came after Election Day. Is it not factual that, and we had some of the folks talk about here from the committee, but it wouldn't take much voter change in behavior to adjust when they vote, if in the prior example of when the bill was passed in 2016, that you basically ended up, people just had extra time. And so prior to that, people knew they didn't have extra time, so they voted earlier. And then, if the same amount of ballots came after Election Day in 2012 as an Election Day in 2024, is it not just the voters adjust their behavior? I mean, there's really no voter suppression. It's just a minor percentage of people that just have to change their behavior, and boom, the entire thing neutralizes, I think, the voter suppression argument. Does it not?
So I would disagree, because neither of us can actually make that claim with any certainty, because we've never had ballots before. If you try to look at 2014, no one ever in history now, because all the data has been destroyed because it was so long ago, will be able to tell you how many ballots came in after, because they really had no reason to track it. We don't have that data. because, you know, if it was before 2017, if the ballot came in after the election, it just was a miscellaneous document. It wouldn't have been counted. It wasn't eligible to be counted. And so we don't have that data. That what I'm even saying is this data that is being presented now about the general primary is the closest to a full and accurate picture of the data of who's impacted that we've ever had, because there's not really systems in place to exactly track this stuff, and certainly wasn't historically in past years. But the voter suppression aspect really comes about because it was in 2016, 2017 that the post office was notifying the state that this was an issue. Ballots are not arriving. People's votes are not going to be counted. The legislature responded by creating the 3-day grace period. We still recognize that, for example, last November, only 2,000, or there were 2,000 people, more than 2,000, who only had their vote counted because of this 3-day grace period. So those votes would be thrown out. And the idea about voter behavior, if you really did a massive poll of the state, I don't know how many people know this exists. I don't think anyone sits there and says, well, I was going to turn it in on the mailbox on Friday, but I have the grace period, so I'm going to wait until, you know, the election day. I don't really think that's how voters operate.
So I don't remember if you testified. I can't remember if it was 2021 or 2022, the first time that I saw this bill. But the Secretary of State did provide the data for before 2017, how many votes came in after the election. And that is part of the record for that committee hearing. I'll try to hunt it down, but that's in the record of the hearing on that bill. So that data does exist. And it was about 2,000 after Election Day, and now it's 2,000 after the 3 days. So committee, I'm going to have to shut this thing down because we are past time. I apologize to you, Representative Penn, that I didn't get you a chance to ask your question of Mr. Barker. So I'm going to close the hearing on Senate Bill 4. And committee, before we leave, we've got minutes for February 4th and February 6th that have been sent out. I would entertain a motion.
Move to approve.
I'll say.
I think the ranking minority member got the second. The motion was made by Representative Sutton. Is there any discussion on the minutes?
Great
Okay.
minutes.
All those in favor of passing the minutes signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no. Okay, the minutes are adopted, and committee, we are adjourned.